Right, welcome along everybody, and welcome to this three-part series where we are going to look at a few things all to do with Microdochium patch. We're going to take a look at the host and the environment and the pathogen in this mini episode. And then in part two, we're going to take a look at integrated strategies. And then in part three, we're going to take a look at fungicide strategies. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Glenn Kirby, the technical manager from Syngenta.
And I'm Henry Bechelet from ICL.
So, Henry, here we are when the spectre of Microdochium patch begins to loom. This is the time when we start to think about constructing our autumn ITM plans, because Microdochium patch or Fusarium can be really damaging. And we need to be fully on our game for the next 5 to 6 months if we're going to come through this unscathed.
Yes, Glenn, I think we will be talking about Microdochium patch for the rest of the year. And yes, we're thinking about our autumn ITM, integrated turf management plans already. And we're not just talking about fungicides here, Glenn, are we? If we want to get through the autumn and winter in good shape, and maybe even with a zero tolerance going on, then we'll need to think more widely and employ all those methods that are available to us to stand any sort of a chance to come through unscathed.
Yeah, that's right, Henry. So are we best starting at the very beginning? Because being able to construct an ITM plan requires us all to have a good understanding of the disease and the condition that favours its development. Ultimately, we're going to need to manage turf in a way that manipulates the condition so it's less likely to suffer an attack.
Yes, Glenn, let's start from the beginning and work our way through to hopefully build that understanding, which helps us to produce an effective disease management plan and ultimately keeps our greens nice and clean. So Microdochium patch disease, or fuzz, is caused by the fungal pathogen Microdochium nivalis. It used to be called Fusarium, but the pathogen was reclassified a number of years ago. But despite this name change, Fusarium patch or fuzz still remains in common use. I will be calling it Microdochium patch, however, from now on.
Yeah, and I'll do my best to refer to it as Microdochium patch too, although old habits do die hard, Henry.
Indeed, indeed. So Microdochium patch is probably the most important of the diseases that currently affects turf grasses in Ireland. It is extremely common everywhere in this region, and it can strike quickly and become extremely damaging, especially to golf greens. The damage can be both unsightly, but it can also have significant and long-lasting impacts on the playing quality of the putting surfaces. Most notably, the scarring can affect surface smoothness, for instance. Because the damage commonly occurs in the autumn and winter, it can be extremely long-lasting, with the scars not growing out until the following spring.
Indeed, I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with that sinking fuzz feeling, Henry.
Yes. Okay, so Microdochium patch affects all the major cool season turfgrass species to varying degrees, but annual meadowgrass, our good friend Poa annua, is particularly susceptible.
That's right. A lot of the grass species are susceptible, aren't they? But they just don't get hit anywhere near as hard. Certainly the most effective control we've seen from the ITM programs we've done in trials is when the sward has a wider range of grass species in there. So not time to give up on that sward transition program yet.
No, absolutely not. Yes, we've done lots of ITM trials that sort of show the relative benefits of things like nutrition, moisture management, and the selective use of iron. But the only trial where we zeroed out the disease compared to 12% infection in the untreated controls was when the sward was dominated by brown top bent rather than Poa annua. So if we want to be properly integrated with our ITM programs, then ideally we need to try to select a less vulnerable host. Then we'll really start getting somewhere.
Indeed.
Okay, so Microdochium nivalis is a particularly interesting and, Glenn, deadly pathogen. Like all our turfgrass pathogens, it develops and infects the host turfgrass plants in order to draw nutrient from it. Simple as that, to fuel its own reproductive life cycle and ultimately produce spores for the next generation to develop. Because the pathogen is very quick to develop and reproduce, it doesn't really have any reason to be like easy on its host. And so the damage can become extremely severe as the pathogen takes all that it can draw from it. The symptoms of the disease, you know, those kind of distinct orange and brown patches that you can see there, they're a reflection of this extreme damage that the disease causes, but that's at the later stages of the disease life cycle.
So whilst those images on the screen there, Henry, aren't too impactful on the putting surface, the pathogen has already gone through its life cycle a few times to get to that stage, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The problem with this disease, Glenn, or one of them, there's quite a lot of problems with this disease, is that the early development and sort of early infection stages can go unseen, really. This means that we can sort of be blissfully unaware that our perfect surfaces have already been infected. The symptoms are a reflection of later stage damage. The infection doesn't show us anything. So look, we could be sort of thinking that everything's going really, really well, but infection has already taken place.
Interesting. So prevention is applying before these images.
Yes, and certainly a long time before these images, which are kind of really late stage, aren't they? Right, let's keep going with the bad news. To make matters worse, Microdochium nivalis is what's known as a saprophytic fungi, which means that it can happily exist on dead and decaying organic matter that is commonly present at the turf base or in the thatch of the upper soil profile. And this means basically, Glenn, that it is always hanging around. It's lying in wait for us, or lying in wait for those conditions for it to develop. Microdochium nivalis is also unusual because it develops in cool and moist conditions, as you can sort of see from the disease triangle where we've got our pathogen, our host, but the environment. These are conditions or sort of weather patterns that are characteristic of Ireland, really, aren't they? Which means that microdochium patch disease can develop at any time of the year over here. And but we tend to experience it more in autumn and winter when the conditions are, I suppose, most suitable for its development, and they're occurring for longer periods.
Yes, I've pulled some weather data out across Ireland, and you can undoubtedly see those climatic challenges across Ireland are there. You've got high rainfall and long periods where we're sat in that optimum temperature range for microdochium development.
Yes, so that's a good point. So what is, do you think, Glenn, what is the optimum temperature range that we're talking about for microdochium patch, Glenn?
Well, the Greencast model is a pretty decent model on the Greencast website. That has the biggest period of development when the temperatures are sitting between 4 and 7 degrees, with kind of the next stage, a decent amount of development between 3 and 9. So if we look at the average data that I've pulled out across Ireland, if we look at Dublin to start with, you can see that kind of red section in the centre is this optimum period for development. And you can see you're sitting in there in Dublin in January, in February, you know, in a cold year, you can go all the way through to April, and you can enter back into that in September very easily. So for a large period of the year, you're going to be sat there. And we don't have to go far. We only got to go over to Galway, and we see it gets even worse. You're in that period for an even longer period of time through the year, depending on whether it's a warm year or a cold year. And we start coupling things up with huge amounts of rainfall over there. So there's some really long periods of rainfall. And of course, the other driving factor beyond temperatures is leaf moisture. So couple those optimum temperatures with leaf moisture and you've got some real challenges. If we go down to Cork, we've got a very similar pattern, breaks a little bit more in your favour, but still high rainfall through the difficult months of October, November, December and January. And if we pop up to Belfast, again, similar pattern. You are in that period for a decent amount of time, not quite as much rainfall as Galway and Cork, but you are still getting leaf moisture issues. Now, one of the other things I did, Henry, is I pulled out some data for Galway for 2020. So I went through the records last year and just looked at the periods of the year through last year where we were sat in those temperature ranges. So what we've got here is the red section is where we're sitting in 4 to 7 degrees, and the orange bit surrounding it is 3 to 9 degrees. So you can start to see this is broken down into a 24-hour period. So for every hour of the day that is in that range, that is where it is highlighted. And you can start to see in October, we were seeing around 9 hours a day on average, sitting in those optimum temperatures. In November, about 14 hours a day. December, around 19 hours a day. In January through to March, about 21 hours a day, where you just sat in that optimum temperature. And even September and June, you're there for around 3 hours of the day, just sitting in this optimum temperature range when the pathogen is capable of developing at its optimum speed.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Glenn, and quite frightening, obviously. So that's the sort of optimal conditions for the pathogen to develop, and you know, after the sort of spores germinate, they send out feeding tubes, don't they, to infect the host, which ultimately draw nutrient from it to fuel the creation of those reproductive structures that ultimately produce spores. And Microdochium nivale produces a huge amount of spores to create further infections. And these can be spread by various means, on clippings or debris, rain splash, mechanical operations, stuff like that. And you know, those spores are really quick to develop. The disease itself can go through its life cycle in 7 to 10 days, especially in those optimal conditions that you just spoke about, Glenn. So outbreaks can, you know, really quickly spiral out of control if conditions are ideal.
Yeah, and it's a pretty uncomfortable feeling when that's going on.
Yeah, to say the least, Glenn. So look, let's just summarize about our pathogen. All right. Microdochium patch is caused by this ubiquitous fungi, Microdochium nivale, that is always lying in wait, and it can pretty much develop at any time, depending on the conditions. Now, if conditions are, you know, ideal, it can develop really quickly. Remember, initially, we can't see that happening. And the outbreak can potentially spiral out of control, you know, with all that spore production, to cause widespread damage if, you know, we don't get it under control. The damage commonly occurs at times of year when recovery growth might be months away. And so the scarring and pitting of the surfaces can linger for months on end. You know, Microdochium patch, Glenn, is a real and difficult problem that needs our full attention in the months ahead.
Yes, it certainly does. Thank you for that, Henry. And I think turf managers around the country are starting to feel like they have less tools to deal with it too. But the greenkeepers don't give in, do they? Let's have a little look in part 2 at all the things we can do to create an integrated plan. And that one will be arriving in your inbox very soon.